Hey, I'm James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are talking about world building. And we are shifting now from branching narrative games into open world games. And part of that transition is having to think more carefully and in more depth about the kind of worlds that we're creating for our games to take place in. In the branching narrative games, we were basically authoring a series of plots for readers to explore. Games could go off in different directions and players made choices that were meaningful, but ultimately it was us that was controlling the pacing and controlling the possibilities and controlling how many different endings could happen and what was the scope that the narrative could take, right? In open world games, players have a lot more agency, and it's really the players that are going to determine the plots. They're the ones that are going to take actions that with their characters that turn into whatever the story is going to be. And our job as the writers of those game stories is to provide a rich and meaningful world for them to interact with, because the setting that we provide is going to determine the kinds of stories that come out when players start interacting with the world. Okay, the kinds of details that we put into our world, the kind of history we put into our world, the kind of cultures we populate our world with, the kinds of conflicts we put into our world for players to engage in. That's our contribution to the game story, our contribution to the meaning of the narrative. Okay, so we need to do some work about what does that mean? How do we construct a world? What are the kinds of things that we need to think about to do that? Okay, so we're going to look at the work of a couple of scholars who talk about what world building is, and then I'll kind of leave you with some things to think about and a couple exercises to do to start inventing your own worlds. Before we do that, I just want to show you one example of the kind of world building that can happen in tabletop role-playing games, which incidentally is a genre that does more and better world building than a lot of fiction sometimes. Let's just take a look at this. This is the Star Wars source book for Star Wars The Role-Playing Game 2nd Edition. Oh, it disappeared again. Boop. Boop. Okay. And by West End Games. West End Games, I think late 70s, early 80s probably, bought the rights for Star Wars to implement it in a role-playing game, and subsequently produced this book. This is the 2nd edition of it. But in this book, they had to hammer out some details about the Star Wars universe that didn't yet exist in the movies. The novels hadn't come out yet. There weren't, cartoons or a lot of the other things that have come since. There wasn't the whole series of movies that we're seeing now. There was just kind of the first 3, I think, at this point. And they needed more information, right? In a movie, you only need to know as much of the world as the audience will see during the film, right? You might need to know some more things about it so you get an idea of why things are happening. But you really only need to know what's showing up on the screen. For a game, you need to know a lot more than that, because you never know what kinds of things players are going to get into, right? If they're jump into an X-Wing fighter and fly off to some planet and land on it, you kind of need to know all the things that they might encounter on that planet. What is what kind of weather conditions might they experience? What kinds of creatures are on that planet? Who are the local inhabitants, and what are their customs and cultures? What will they take offense from if players do the wrong thing? Or what will they like, right? What kinds of holidays might they be celebrating? You need to know all kinds of weird things. You also need to know exactly how much firepower does an X-Wing fighter have versus a TIE fighter. What are their shield systems like? And how do you know how to measure the damage that a blast from a blaster might do to stormtrooper armor? Stuff like that. You have to measure all that stuff. So how do they do that? Let's just look at the table of contents here real quick. Okay, so you can see they've got entries for space, starcraft, starfighters, combat ships, space transports, all the different kinds of droids you might run into, their function and their stats, different kinds of repulsor lift vehicles, which includes everything from land speeders and skiffs to speeder bikes and swoops. The AT-ATs and the ATSTs. You have several entries here about different kinds of aliens that showed up in the series, and more details about them, right? Like, what is a Wookiee, and where are they from, and what is their culture like, and what's their language exactly? Different kinds of creatures you might run into, non-sentient alien life. Different kinds of equipment, a whole chapter on lightsabers and how they operate and how they actually function, and why don't they just shoot out beams forever, and what is it that Jedi do to construct them. Different kinds of stormtroopers, maps for rebel bases and imperial bases, and then of course you have entries for the non-player characters, which are the big heroes of the film, right? If you're going to play this game, you're not going to be Luke Skywalker or Leia. You're going to be somebody else in the universe. And now you might encounter Luke Skywalker, or you might hear about them, but you're not going to be them. So this is like rules and stats for if you're hanging out with these people. If you have to fight Darth Vader, how screwed are you, right? And this is going to tell you that. So let's look. Should we look at something? Yeah, let's just look at Wookiees really quick. You can get an idea of the depth that they put into this. Not too far. Somewhere around here. Here we go, Wookiees. Wookiees are intelligent anthropoids that typically grow to a height of over 2 meters, blah, blah, blah. Piercing blue eyes, thick fur covers their bodies. So descriptions, capable of gentle compassion and deep abiding friendship. So something about their personality types. Mastered in use of high-tech weapons and blasters. Communicate with a series of grunts and growls. All kinds of details about who they are and what you can expect from them. How you as a player might play one of them, or how the game master might play one of them as a non-player character, what they should do to have you interact with them. And then also stats, right? How quick are they? How knowledgeable are they? How good are they with mechanical stuff? And how likely is it that you might be able to sneak up? I can't highlight that. How likely is it that you might be able to sneak up on one? How good is their perception, right? If you have to fight one, how strong are they? And then here's some kind of special abilities that they have in combat, like Berserker Rage, climbing skills and stuff. Story factors and ways. This is sort of like ways that the GM might introduce them into the narrative, and how they might weigh a Wookiee in a narrative versus other kinds of creatures. Whole little sidebar here about Wookiee customs. Let's read a little bit of this. Wookiees have an interesting custom concerning friendships and debts of honor. Their most sacred practice is the life debt. This is a Wookiee oath of allegiance that is pledged to a person or persons that have saved a Wookiee's life. So maybe this gives you an idea about the relationship between Han and Chewie, maybe not. But it gives you a sense of the culture behind Wookiees, right? They're not just walking carpets that grunt. They're sending life from a different planet that has different attributes and traits and physical characteristics and culture and training, and right. We need this kind of detail in a game. We don't need this in the movie, right? We just need to see Chewie and hear him grunt, and it's kind of funny and interesting, right? See his relationship with Han. But in a game, we need to know, like, how do these things work? Where are they from? What do they do? If I go to the Wookiee planet, what can I expect? Can I be greeted? If I save a Wookiee's life, what's going to happen, right? I need to know all those things, because you never know in a game what kinds of situations might come up and how the GM is going to resolve them. So you fill books like this with all kinds of details so the game master knows what to do. And, this is not unique to the Star Wars role-playing game. This is true for Dungeons & Dragons, and all kinds of other role-playing games have source book material like this, setting guides and adventures that give you all kinds of information about a world and its cultures and its economy and landscape and all kinds of stuff like that. So this is the kind of thing we're getting into now, which is this fleshing out the details of a universe to make it playable, right? I need all the information so that we can play in this world. And be meaningful, right? So that we can have meaningful experiences, meaningful engagement with Wookiee culture, right? because we want to see that in the narrative. Okay. So that's the gist of it. That's the gist of what world building is. It's filling out details, and especially in games, you need to do a lot of it. Especially in tabletop role-playing games where the player has so much freedom. You need a lot of detail for the game master to be able to respond to their choices in ways that, continue the narrative. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? What's the procedure here, and what kinds of things should we be shooting for when we start world building? Well, for that, we're going to turn to a couple of scholars. First is going to be Mark Wolf here in his book, Building Imaginary Worlds, which is quite good. Tells you a lot of the things you need to know about how world building works, and he's particularly focused on world building in fiction. Some film, but mostly novels and such. Not so much games, although he does mention them. But what he says here applies equally to games, too. And we'll just pick a few quotes from him. He says, we can arrange fictional worlds along a spectrum of attachment to or reliance on the primary world. On the primary world end of the spectrum would be non-fictional autobiography. Moving down the spectrum, historical novels or films leave the realm of documentary, creating fictional versions of actual events, characters, and places. Further down the spectrum, we find what we might call overlaid worlds. For example, stories involving Spider-Man are set in a version of New York City. Even further along the spectrum are separate or scholarly worlds. Or secondary worlds. Secondary worlds differ the most from the primary world. That differ the most from the primary world contain the most subcreation. Okay, so heavy quote. But let me pick a few things out of this. He's saying, when you're building a world, you need to think about how different is it going to be from the world that we already live in. Is it going to be basically the same world with a few tweaks? Or is it going to be a totally different world? And he kind of says, well, there's a spectrum from our world to totally different world, and kind of shades of in between, right? On the primary world end is non-fictional autobiography, which creates a world. When I tell my life story, I'm telling it from my personal perspective, from my memory, which is not going to be perfect. And it will create a world that's pretty much like the real world, and maybe even identical to the actual historical world. But there'll be a few differences, because if you ask somebody else about the same instance or same memory, they'll remember it a little bit differently, right? But it's pretty close to real, we hope. And then a little bit further along, you have things like historical novels, meaning it's set in real history or in the real world somewhere. It could be even a contemporary novel does this too, right? Where it's set in the real world now. But the characters and events are fictional. They're made up. Some of the events might be real, you might have a Civil War novel that faithfully follows certain events in the Civil War, but the character and their ideas and their feelings and their family relationships and their dialogue is totally made up. So there's a tweak on the real world, right? Still, though, not a lot of world building happening in either of those. Here, in these last two, is where you get most of the world building. Further down the spectrum, we find what we might call overlaid worlds. An overlaid world is it's basically our world. It's New York City, except that Spider-Man lives there, and the Avengers show up. Thor hangs out there, and Iron Man does too, right? That's a really different world than ours, even though it's the same world as ours. You can, buy a hot dog on the same corner of the street in Marvel Universe as you can in real New York City, I assume. Or you can do those same kind of New York City things that you can in our world and theirs. But our world doesn't have people getting bit by radioactive spiders and then developing superpowers. And we don't have Thor flying around coming down from Asgard, right? So there's a tweak to our world. It's sort of everything is the same except this one big important thing, which is people can develop superpowers. And then that changes things quite a bit. That changes the kind of stories you can tell. So that is an invented world, but it's laid on top of existing reality. And that's true for other genres too, post-apocalyptic fiction, for example, where you have our world, but you just sort of tick the clock forward a little bit and say, and then the world ended, and now people are living in the ruins of it, right? It's our world, but a pretty significant difference has happened. And then further down along the spectrum are totally separate or secondary worlds, like Star Wars, for example. It's a totally separate or secondary world. It's not based on New York City. It's It's not based on anything that we know. In fact, our planet presumably exists somewhere in the Star Wars universe because it says galaxy far, far away a long time ago. So we exist in their future, but distant in the universe, maybe. So I guess it could be an overlaid world, but not really, right? The Star Wars universe and all of its stuff exists completely out of our realm of knowledge in some other space. And that would be true of a lot of fantasy worlds. J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth is, again, supposed to be in our history, but it's not really, right? It's not based on our world. It's based on Fantasyland. And he invented quite a lot of things for that. So this last piece that it says, where secondary worlds that differ the most from the primary world. Let's see, can I get that up? Yeah. Secondary worlds that differ the most from the primary world contain the most subcreation. That just means like the more different your world is from the normal world or the primary world, the more work you have to do to clarify those details, right? If your story is New York, but some kind of twist in reality, you've got less work to do than reality is different and the place is different and the time is different, and right, you got more work to do if your world's very, very different. Okay, what else? Things to shoot for. So he gives us kind of like a, how should I say this? He gives us like a standard to measure like how good are we doing at world building. These are some things we should try for. In fact, I kind of blow this up a little bit more. All right, so things to shoot for: invention, completeness, and consistency. It says invention can be defined as the degree to which default assumptions based on the primary world have been changed regarding such things as geography, history, language, physics, biology, etc. In other words, this is the difference that you're making. It's like our world, but the biology is different, or there's this new kind of animal, or physics works differently, or something different happened in history, or etc., right? It's the novel, new thing that you're bringing to your world, the invention that you're doing. So you need that if you're going to world build. You need to have something unique, something new. About completeness, he says, true completeness is impossible. You could never nail down every single detail about the Star Wars universe, right? You don't know the number of bristles on a toothbrush on some guy's basement in Tatooine, right? You can't know everything. So completeness then refers to the degree to which the world contains explanations and details covering all the various aspects of its characters' experiences, as well as background details which together suggest a feasible, practical world, and illusion of completeness will become one of the sub-creator's goals. So you basically, he's talking about narrative here, you just need enough detail to fill out your character's experiences and make them believable, right? So that's the illusion of completeness. Now this is more, there's more weight on you in a game world, like I've said before, because you don't really know all of the things that your characters might be doing. So you need more background details than you would in fiction, right? To fill out all the possible character experiences. Then he says, consistency is the degree to which world details are plausible, feasible, and without contradiction. This requires careful integration of details and attention to the way everything is connected together. Lacking consistency, a world may begin to appear sloppily constructed or even random and disconnected. So basically, you're going to invent all these different pieces of a universe. They should make sense together, right? If you've got people that fly, and then you put them in a situation where they're in danger, but they could get out of it by flying, you can't have them say, oh no, what will we do, right? Because everybody will be shouting at the screen, just fly away. So consistency throughout your stories, consistency throughout your plots and your worlds. Different pieces of the world should fit together well, and you should be thinking about how do they integrate, right? How do they work together? If we're going to have, for example, in the Star Wars universe, you have interplanetary travel. That's very easy. Star system travel, that's very easy. You can just jump to light speed and get somewhere else pretty quickly. And so, therefore, you have little towns on a desert planet with creatures from all over the place in the bar, right? You have pretty rich, diverse populations on their planets from all over the place. That's consistency, right? If we have faster than light travel, but cities that are not diverse, then you might wonder, like, well, why? How come these people aren't traveling to each other's worlds, right? Okay, invent new stuff. Invent it completely enough so that the players feel like the world is totally there, it's real, and be consistent. Don't create contradictions where if we start thinking about the details of the world, they stop making sense, right? You want it to make sense even under scrutiny. All right, last thing from Mark Wolf. He offers a series of secondary world infrastructures, which are something that we'll maybe revisit at some point. In other words, you build this world, what holds it together? What makes it make sense to readers? And he says, well, the story makes it make sense, the narrative. He also says maps are helpful, like Tolkien draws maps of his world in his books. But certainly in role-playing games, you want maps of star systems and maps of planets and maps of rebel bases and all kinds of stuff like that. Timelines, which help us get a sense of the history of the world, why things are the way they are, and where we are in the timeline, and that crucial point of history where things are changing around us and what stories are happening right now. Genealogies are maps of relationships, particularly family relationships over time, but you could also draw maps of different kinds of relationships, like, the chain of command in some kind of organization, like the Rebel Alliance. Nature, and here he means how nature works. This means flora and like animals and plants and stuff, but it also means how do the laws of physics work in this world? Those should be consistent and true and hold everywhere, right? Culture, meaning all the things that people produce, all the things that they do, from art and literature to politics and culture and language and mythology and philosophy, the sort of last things he talks about here. There should sort of be a consistent feel to these in the different cultures you create. We'll come back to this in a minute. We'll come back to kind of a list like this at the end. But I want to keep moving because I also want to talk about some insights from Trent Hergenrother, whose book is not out yet. It's forthcoming. Should be, if you're watching this in like 2018 or something. Maybe I've remembered to add a link to it somewhere. But he talks about, Mark Wolf's book is basically about how have authors done world building in the past. Trent Hergenrother's book is about how we as game creators and story writers, how we can do world building, right? And what does he say? This is a lot of things that I won't be able to pick out in total, but I'm picking out a few things here that might be useful. He gives us the sort of framework for world building, which is just sort of some questions to think about as you're building your world. One is, how big is the world? What's the scope? When is your story happening in the world's history? So what's the sequence of events here? Because that matters, and I'll show you in a second why. The perspective is who is presenting the world. In fiction, it's like who's the narrator, what's their position in the world, and why are they giving you the kinds of details that they are, right? So, for example, in more detail, scope, he suggests, is a combination of the breadth of the world and the depth of the world. Breadth refers to how large is the world that you're building. If you're building Star Wars and it's multiple galaxies, that's pretty broad. But you might have a game like Gone Home, where the world is only as big as the house that you're exploring, right? And there's a whole social, cultural world inside that house. So breadth can be huge or it can be quite small. Depth refers to how finely grained the detail is of that world. And remember, for games, it has to be pretty finely grained, right? We need to know what happens when we encounter this spot in this world under these circumstances, right? You can see sort of in his slide here, he's got a series of slides that they tick down into closer and closer into this spot in Brazil until he finally gets all the way down to this beach where there's a police officer leaving a flower at some sort of memorial site where it looks like a bunch of people died on this beach. And he says, by the way, your story starts here, right? Which is a helpful reminder, even if your world is very broad and has lots of places in it, it's not yet a world where we can create a game story or play narratively until we have characters who are experiencing that world. This lady has a role in her world, a role in her culture. She has relationships, apparently, that she's experienced some significant loss recently. And she is in this place and time in a way that's rich and meaningful, right? It's heartbreaking. And that's what you need. That's the level of detail you need in order to start playing a game story, right? So we need that big structure. We need that big, how big is the space, and all the little details of different places that she might go in this world. But we also need the little details, like what is it like to be a police officer? Why did this event happen? What does it mean? How does loss and grief negotiated in this culture, right? We need to know those things too in order to actually make the narrative work. So that's scope. Sequence, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but this is like a map of time, more or less. This goes from the 1200s to the 1900s, and the different colored bands here represent the size and influence of different empires over time, or different nations, and I think the papacy is, the Pope is represented here too. So this is like all kinds of history, all kinds of political maneuvering and war and developments. And Hergenrother uses this map to just show the difference here of, like, if you locate your character in the Ming Dynasty, in the transition between the Emperor Hongwu and Yongle, her life experience is going to be shaped by completely different elements than this guy's, who's born just after the Civil War ends in the United States, right? This guy's life experience and her life experience are shaped by completely different forces in this stream. Even though it's technically the same world, quote unquote, their experience of it, their perspective on it, is completely shaped by when they are in it as much as where they are in it, right? So when you're thinking about the history of the world, you want to be thinking about those big powers, how they move around, but also how the way they've shaped the world around them affects the lives of individual people, right? Okay, and then perspective for Hergenrother. Perspective is about who's telling the story, and in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit, it's told by Bilbo and Frodo. So we get this world through their lens, through their point of view. In game worlds, though, the important thing to remember is that players encounter the game world through the perspective of the player character. Players encounter the game world through the perspective of the player character. So you're going to invent this world, and it's going to be however broad it is, however deep it is. It's going to take place in a certain kind of history that you invent, and then you're going to take the player character and place them in that world in a particular position. Maybe you place them in the Ming Dynasty as a young girl. Is she high up in the social status, in the courts, or in the in the empire, or is she a peasant girl? Is she the daughter of a merchant? Who is she in this world, and how does she fit in? Where are the players going to enter this world, and how are they going to perceive it based on the perspective character that you give them, right? So you need to build out the world, and you need to build out the situations well enough so that the players get a sense of this history and get a sense of the world from a very local perspective, right? Okay, is there anything else here? Oh, and then Trent gives us a list similar, not totally dissimilar, to Mark Wolf's, which is about different things to consider when you're building your world, and he breaks these into four parts. When you're building a culture or a world, you need to know how is it governed. You need to know the cultural influences that are present, the social relations that are present, and the economy. And he breaks those into different subcategories. This is not an exhaustive list for him, and Mark Wolf's list was not exhaustive for him either. These are just sort of like core things that you should know about a world once you've built it. And of course, there are more that you would want to investigate as well. Okay, well, that was a lot. There was like a lot of things to look at. So summing up and moving on. I've kind of put together a list of questions based on both of these guys' work to help us start thinking about worlds that we could build. So I don't know, you might want to write these down, pause the video and write these down, or take a screen cap or something. But this is a core list of questions. It's not an exhaustive list either. It's just sort of stuff from them stuck together with a few other things thrown in. There's more stuff to think about, but these are categories to start thinking of when you start inventing a world. How different is it going to be from our world, right? Is it going to be overlaid like Spider-Man, or is it going to be completely separate and secondary like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings? How broad will it be? How much space will it include? Like, galaxies like Star Wars, or just a single house like Gone Home, or a neighborhood, or a country? How deep will it be? How much detail do we need? And I keep kind of coming back to this point of in game worlds, you kind of need a lot, but exactly how much is hard to say. And in the next video, I think we'll get a better idea of exactly the kinds of details you need to insert in order to give a sense of a complete world. Where are we at in history, right? Where are we at in that timeline? Are we in the future of our present world, right? Or somewhere in the past? Or what is the present tense in this other world that you've invented? What's the present tense of the game story? Where does it take place? What is nature like in terms of the plants and animals, but also in terms of the laws of physics? Is there magic present? If so, what are its limitations? How does one interact with that? Who's there? Who's there in this world and why? Is everybody the same? What are their differences? Where do those differences come from? And what is the history of these people that got them together, or what are the conflicts among them? Culture in terms of what do people produce? What kinds of things do they make in their art, in their manufacturing, in their ideas, in terms of economy? A lot of these things are culture that follow. Like, where are they making their money? How are they eating? How are they getting by? Is there a disparity between the rich and the poor? If so, why does that exist? What is it like to be poor versus what is it like to be rich? What sorts of technology is available in your world? And how does it get used? How is it distributed? Who gets to use it and who doesn't? Who rules the world and how? How do things get decided? And then how do those decisions get implemented, right? What kinds of laws are there, and who is subject to the law and who is not? How is justice distributed, if at all? How are decisions like that made? What sort of rights do people have in the face of the law? When you get sick, what do? Do you go to a doctor, or is there something else? Do you have to pay for that or not? How do you interact with healthcare, and what is health? What is healthiness and healthy living and healing in this culture? How do people get educated? Do they get educated? What sorts of learning happens and how? If there are formal institutionalized religions, how do those operate? What sort of power do they have? What sort of rituals are there? How do people get together and what do they talk about? Are there sacred texts? Or are there sacred places? If philosophy is sort of more like, by this I sort of mean, what do people generally believe and how do they relate to the world around them, right? How do they sort of enact their beliefs in their culture and in their social relationships? What sort of family structures are there? How is family built? Is it, different partners that produce offspring, or is it some other, what do people do? How is gender constructed? Is it a strict male-female binary of some kind, or some other kind of binary, where any kind of deviation from that is punished and taboo? Or is there a more fluid definition of gender where people can kind of express who they are in different ways? When it comes to sexuality, what's taboo and what's not? What kinds of sexual expression are permitted and which are not? What kinds of sexual identity are endorsed and which are oppressed? What is an able body and how is that defined? What is a disabled body and how is that defined? What is it like to be disabled in this culture? What is mental health and how is that constructed? When someone is labeled as mentally ill, how are they treated? What is their experience like? Is there a history of race and racism in this world? And if so, who's the beneficiary? Who is privileged by that and who is oppressed by that? In terms of ethnicity, like the differences in people and where they're from, what kinds of diversity does that bring up? What kinds of conflict does that bring up? What kinds of potential stories can come out of people coming together across cultures? And then intersectionality represents like, how do all these different things work together, right, in your world? And especially in terms of individual experiences. So if you're in a world where it's a fascist dictatorship with an extreme punishing rule of law that, enforces a very rigid gender binary, what is it like, and has a history of sort of white supremacy and racism? And then what is it like to be someone who's trans and black, right? Those two different kinds of oppression will intersect in that person's life. They will experience gender-based oppression and race-based oppression in their experience. And on the flip side of that, if you are cisgender and white in a white supremacist culture that enforces a strict gender binary, then you'll experience a certain kind of privilege, right? So those two social forces will interact in ways to your benefit. So intersectionality encourages you to think about how do these things work together and how do they collectively influence or shape a person's life experience. And then the final questions would be, once you've thought about all these different things for your world, where do you place the player character inside it? Where do you want them to inhabit it? How do you want them to relate to these different systems or experience these different systems that you've set up? How do you want them positioned in terms of the politics, right? And then why? So that's a lot to think about, right? There's a lot of work there to do in building a world. More work to do if you're inventing from scratch than there is to do if you're sort of, New York plus Spider-Man. An overlaid world is easier. But still not simple. So let's look at a couple assignments that could come out of this. Here's some, I guess I would treat these as options, right? Assignment A would begin by modeling our world. Take these different options, all this stuff, and look at like the town you live in, the city, town, or some sort of local area that you live in. And think about, that defines your breadth and depth. And your history is already there because it's real, right? The present tense would be now. We know where we are. We know how. You can tell us a little bit about the animals and plants and stuff, but we know the laws of physics. Who's there? Who's in your town and why are they there? If you live in North America and you live in a rural place and most of the people are white, why is that? How did white people get to North America? How do they get to your particular town? And why is it like that now? How come it's not more diverse, right? What happened to the people who lived there before the white people? Where did they go? If you live in a town that's more diverse than that, then where did all these different kinds of people come from? What's their history here? What kinds of cultural expression do these different groups have? And how does it influence the kinds of experiences that are available in this place? Who's got money? Who doesn't have money? What kinds of technology is there? Who has access to that technology, etc., right? You can go through each of these and talk about, like, what is it like in our world in these different categories? And sort of flesh out the town or the city or the area or whatever where you live. Give us a good sense of that. You might even draw a map or something or create a timeline like was suggested by Mark Wolf up here. Narratives, maps and timelines and genealogies. If that helps you flesh out the world you live in, go for it. So that'll be the first part of assignment A, was just get a sense of what your world, let's change that, model your world. Where you live in and what is it like in these different areas, right? And then make one significant change. And by significant, I mean something that really flips the world on its head, like people have superpowers, or magic is real, or aliens just visited, or the world just ended, or some kind of big difference. It doesn't have to be as generic as the things I just mentioned, but something big, right? Especially something like here, like history went different, or we're in the future and something has happened, or what you thought was true about the universe actually isn't. There's dragons from space that are invisible and they whisper in people's ears, and now some people can see them, right? Give us some kind of big, fantastic difference, but in the world that you live in. Then, once you have that, think through all the implications of that change, right? If there really are space dragons that are invisible and whisper in people's ears, and the more people believe in them, the more visible they become, what is that going to mean for all of these other areas of our lives, right? Well, we know it's a difference in the natural world, but how is it going to affect people? How is it going to affect cultural production? What kinds of things might people, art and literature and music and stuff, might people start making differently? What kinds of rituals or customs might develop out of that? Will that affect the economy in some way? Will people make weird decisions economically based on what these space dragons are telling them? Can they help us develop some kind of new technology, or will people develop technologies to listen better to the weird dragons? Will it affect politics? Will it affect laws? Is this going to be outlawed, or will we pass laws based on what these dragons are saying? How might it change the way we believe about the world and the kinds of practices we engage in? Will it change religion or education? Will it change the way that we access healthcare? Will it make any difference to the way that we construct gender and the kinds of sexuality that gets oppressed or expressed? The way that we construct ideas about mental health might be come into question here, right? So, and who are these dragons talking to? Is it a kind of resource that a certain ethnic group is defending against others, or does it maybe help people come across different lines of ethnicity because they are the certain people chosen by space dragons who are going to talk to them? This is kind of a corny example, but I think you can see that a weird change in the world can have a big impact. It can affect all kinds of areas of that world, right? It could be just like your town, but you introduce some weird new element, and suddenly things are getting very different, right? In all kinds of areas. So you want to think through that, and you want to make note of the kinds of conflicts that would emerge. Given invisible space dragons whispering in people's ears, what kinds of conflict might that bring up? Maybe conflict of people who don't believe in them and people who do, or people who think they're being told one thing, people who think they're being told something else, or different interpretations of what they're saying, right? There could be all kinds of potential struggles and arguments over what to do based on this, or how we ought to live in response to this. So think through those, and then think about, if you're going to place a player character in this world, how are you going to place them? Are they going to be someone who hears the space dragons or not? Are they going to be someone, if you're in Star Wars, are they going to be, the son of a Sith Lord who has been hidden from his father and doesn't even know he's a Jedi, lives on this desert planet somewhere? Or is it going to be a bounty hunter who's just, now working for the government, working to have his government job, doing bounty hunting stuff for the Empire, right? How are you going to place the player character? And then, of course, what kinds of stories might emerge from that placement? Think about different options of where you would place them, and then think, how might those stories play out? What are the different possibilities for how those stories would play out? And thinking through that will help you think through, is that the kind of story I want to tell? Do I want to place them differently? And also, what kinds of details do I need to populate the world with in order for those kinds of stories to take place? A bounty hunter story in Star Wars needs different kinds of details than young Jedi story needs. Maybe you want a world that has, a source book that has all that detail, but you want to think through that. Okay, so that would be sort of option A for this assignment. I think it's a good place to start, right, with an overlaid world. Assignment B would be to repeat the same process, but with an existing fictional world. So instead of starting with our world, you'd model, or your world, you'd model Star Wars, or you'd model Lord of the Rings, or you'd model, I don't know, Bambi or something like that, right? What kind of world happens in this fiction along these different lines? What pieces of this this list show up in those worlds, and how do they show up, and what are we supposed to think about them? And then think through, how would you put a tweak in that fictional world, and how would that change things, and what kind of stories would come out, and where would you place characters. Go through the whole process, but instead of with our real world or your real world, go through it with somebody else's fictional world, your favorite TV show or your favorite movie or novel that you like or something. All right, option C would be to start from scratch. This is basically the same process again, but starting completely from scratch and saying we're going to invent something that's not based on our world at all. We're going to start from bare bones and work our way up from extremely different. How big is this world going to be? How deep is this world going to be? What's the history of the place? Think through all of these categories and build out an entirely unique world, right, to populate your story with. Think through all the categories and more, meaning you might find yourself talking about this world and find that you want to develop details that aren't in any of these categories, because this is not an exhaustive list. So go with it. Find whatever it is that the world takes you to as you're inventing stuff. Just write it down. Especially think about how these categories or these things you're inventing interrelate. How do they intersect? How do they influence each other? Especially in the lives of individuals, right? Because that begins to be the stuff of stories. And then make notes of the conflicts, where do you place the characters, and how those different placements lead to different stories, okay? I think this is a good set of assignments. I think if you did all of them, you'd certainly have a good handle on world building, but it's a lot of work. So, if you're watching this out there in YouTube land and thinking, I'm not going to do all that, but you want to do something, then just pick one, right? Pick whatever seems most productive or interesting to you and start thinking about the kind of world you want to build. Okay, I think that's it. I've probably talked much longer than I should have, but we should have a good idea now of what world building is all about. We talked about Wolf and Hergenrother. I showed you the Star Wars thing. And we talked about the kinds of details you're going to have to get at in order to do this. So next time we will talk about environmental storytelling. We'll talk about how to shape spaces that communicate the world to their players. So that'll give you a little bit more idea of exactly what kind of fine-grained detail do I need to communicate something. But for right now, think big, right? Think, how does the universe work and how can we change that? Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.